welcome to this second session of our March lecture series on Japan as a regional security actors. As you may know, this is part of a course that is offered by the newly funded Japan program at the VUB on Japan's foreign and security policy. And last week, we deciphered the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that is really at the core of Japan's regional strategy since 2016, at least. And today, we will have a look at the relations between Japan and China. And we can easily say that facing and managing China's rise is the key strategic challenge for Japan in the 21st century. As you know, the two neighbors have a complicated relationship made both of a close economic interdependence, but also very strong political distrust. Not to mention the strategic competition between China and the US, who is adding actually another layer of complexities on the bilateral relation. And so today I'm very, very much delighted to have a super speaker with us to help us better grasp this, the various dimensions of this key relations for the Indo-Pacific. And thus I would like to introduce Elena Atanassova-Cornelis. And Elena is a senior lecturer at the University of Antwerp and Leuven. She is also a visiting professor at the University of Kent and associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Research interests and expertise include international relations in the Asia-Pacific region, especially on this security dimension. She is one of the best experts on Japan's foreign and security policy, and she has numerous publications on this and on various geostrategic dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. And above all, I must say that she is an amazing speaker. So I am really sure that we'll have a great time listening to her presentation. So it was worth waiting for it a little bit more. So she will offer a comprehensive approach looking at the Sino-Japan relation through both a constructivist perspective, because as you know, much of the relations is about mutual perceptions, national identity issues, and so on. But she will also adopt a realist perspective because she will highlight the driver of the geopolitical rivalry between the neighbors. She will also explain how concrete this rivalry is becoming for Japan, in particular regarding the tense situation, the tense tension in the East China Sea. And then right after a presentation, we'll have the pleasure to welcome our very own Eva Pejsova, who is the Japan fellow at VUB. And Eva will provide some complementary remarks on the situation in the South China Sea this time. And she will try to clarify the challenges posed by China in this region and highlight also the implication for the Japan-China relations. And before starting, I would just encourage you all to start thinking about your question for the speakers. And please do write down your question in the Q&A box of your Zoom window. I will collect them and I will directly address them to our two speakers. And please do not wait for the last minutes if you want to make sure that your question gets a proper answer. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Elena finally to start a presentation of about 45 minutes. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Céline, thank you very much for the fascinating introduction. And of course, technology is great when it works, right? Sometimes it does not work, but as you point out, it's a really fascinating topic. And I'm sure that our audience has been waiting to hear the views and the assessment that I have the pleasure of presenting. And of course, Eva later on reflecting on this. What I will do now, I will start sharing my screen, and I hope it will be visible. If there are any issues, just I'm afraid I get a message: host disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm not able to share my screen.
Eva, I think you're host of the webinar.
Oh gosh.
Can you?
I did make Elena co-host, but I'm not sure if.
Yeah, now it is. Now it should be working. Now it should be working. No worries at all. Let's see. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, let me see. We go to slideshow.
Yeah, we will get through it. No
it
problem.
should be working now, I hope.
Yeah, we'll do it.
Okay, fantastic. So thanks again for the kind invitation to speak about Japan-China relations, geopolitical competition and shifting identities. As Céline has rightly pointed out, is a complicated relationship where we have a number of drivers which interact and influence the outcome in the bilateral relations. And so my outline for this morning's presentation, I have essentially three main sections, three main parts that I would like to focus the attention of the audience on. The first will be on strategic objectives and divergences from a more geopolitical perspective. Then I will look at shifting national identities and mutual perceptions, which are very much important in helping us understand the Japan-China relations and this rivalry that we have been observing for a number of years. And finally, the third section will look at the key areas of strategic rivalry with a particular focus on, for example, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision and China's Belt and Road, and with some reflections on the East China Sea territorial dispute. Strategic objectives and divergences, essentially my presentation is divided. I will be looking first at Japan, then I will look at China, then again Japan, and then China, so that our audience can have a comprehensive and also view and somewhat in a comparative perspective what they see as their objectives, on what they diverge, and what the key issues are. So starting with Japan, Japanese strategic objectives and policies, we have to keep in mind that Japan's strategic geography very much influences its objectives and policies as for any other country. And in particular for Japan, given the fact that Japan is highly dependent on resources, it actually imports close to 90% of its resources from outside, in particular from the Middle East. And it's very much dependent on free and open sea lanes of communication, which carry trade routes, which carry Japanese imports of resources from the Middle East, and also from Japan, goods to countries in the region and to Europe as well. So it's not surprising that the key strategic objectives is essentially defending supply lines and also offshore islands. The focus on offshore islands, what I mean here is in particular the reference to the East China Sea maritime strategic space, which in recent years have become the focus of attention for Japanese strategies, given the growing tensions with China over the disputed territories, Senkaku in Japanese, Diaoyu in Chinese. The second important objective, I would argue, is preventing Chinese coercion and domination. And again, this is that we observe over the past 10 years, it's gradually have become a focus of the attention of Japanese strategies. One of the nightmare scenarios from the perspective of Japan is a possible Chinese interdiction of supply lines, right? Cutting off supplies, which of course for Japan would mean a real threat to the survival of the nation. And so this is one aspect of Japan's concern, and it's also a worry about Japan has about Chinese coercion, economic coercion policies, which Japan, as other countries in the region, have already experienced in relation, for example, to the territorial dispute with China. And finally, the long-term actually aspect of this concern is the longer worry about where is China heading to. Are there any objectives, for example, for Chinese decision makers to establish a hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region? The third strategic objective is for Japan, very critical, falls within the scope of what is known as the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. The free and open Indo-Pacific vision focuses on promoting specific fundamental values, rule of law, then freedom of navigation, also focuses on economic prosperity, interconnectivity, and finally, of course, commitment for peace and stability. And within the framework of the free and open Indo-Pacific region is Japanese objective of maintaining with like-minded partners, including the European Union, maritime order, both in the Asia-Pacific and beyond in the broader Indo-Asia-Pacific region. So what have been the specific policies? And I would like to point out the first important pillar has been the reinforcement of the US-Japan alliance and the role of Japanese self-defense forces, both within the framework of the alliance, but also independently outside the alliance, which we have been observing under the Obama administration and also under the Trump administration, as the US-Japan alliance does remain a critical or the most critical pillar for Japan in order to achieve its objectives. The second very important aspect of Japanese policies falls within the scope of what we call strategic diversification. In other words, while the US-Japan alliance remains the main pillar for Japan, Japan is diversifying its security and strategic relations by establishing military security ties, also economic partnership ties with various regional, but also extra-regional countries. Extra-regional countries in particular, I would mention countries beyond the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. For example, the UK and France have been the two critical partners for Japan from Europe in recent years, that we see intensification of these bilateral security interactions with a reference to the Indo-Pacific, as well as Japan's relations with the European Union. What this diversification we call alignments. In other words, these are partnerships that are not based on treaty. There's no mutual defense obligations, and yet in recent years we see increasing resources Japan devotes to developing these partnerships, and also attention, diplomatic attention by Japanese decision makers. The final important pillar is supporting ASEAN-led inclusive multilateralism, and as you see on the slide, I actually highlighted inclusive because it does remain very important from the perspective of Japan. Japan's vision of promoting also an exclusive regional order is very much in line with this support for ASEAN-led inclusive multilateralism. Now, if we look at China's side, so what are Chinese strategic objectives and policies? Of course, the United States does remain, from China's perspective, the player, the power that is perceived actually as trying to prevent China's rise, even to contain in Chinese official discourse, the word containment has been used. So what China has been trying to do is to limit US regional influence, however, without openly confronting Washington. In other words, trying to use different policies, a combination of different tools, avoiding direct military confrontation, but trying to undermine in a more indirect way US regional influence. The key focus in maritime Asia has been for China to resolve sovereignty disputes, of course, from the perspective of Chinese interests, and to prevent a counterbalancing coalition, US-led or Japan-led coalition. What have been the specific policies? Now, within the Chinese official discourse on the President Xi Jinping, of course, we are all familiar with the Chinese dream. One important element I would like to point out without going deep into the discussion of Chinese dream is that President Xi, but also Chinese leaders and also Chinese people do see China already from the perspective as a rule shaper. In other words, not only a rule follower. They want, especially Chinese public opinion, they want to see China participating actively in global governance in various institutions, and China being already a driver of various rules rather than simply a follower. Striving for achievements, that's an important aspect of Xi Jinping's discourse, which actually refers to this narrative of China becoming a global leader and of China by 2049, as we all know, striving to become a global player with a powerful and one of the most modern militaries in the world. China has been applying reward and punish strategy in the Indo-Pacific region, a strategy which essentially is trying to divide potential anti-China countries from each other, divide and rule, so that China prevents this anti-China balancing coalition, rewarding countries with economic incentives, Belt and Road and other economic and trade sources of attraction, economic attraction, and punishing countries by using various aspects of economic and military coercion, punishing countries which operate against Chinese interests. And here comes the tools that China has been actually using, combination of military tools, coercive diplomacy, but also non-military tools, both economic and diplomatic tools. And I would like just to bring to your attention these two quotes that I found, in my view, capturing very much the essence of one of the essences of Chinese foreign policy. President Xi, back in 2013, said that no country should presume that China will trade its core interests or will allow harm to be done to China's sovereignty, security, or development interests. So you see, this is a very clear language. That's a message sending to the United States, to its allies, to the world, but also domestically. And the second, more recent, from the 19th Congress in 2017, when President Xi said that no one should expect China to swallow anything that undermines its interest, which shows that China has the resolve, the determination to defend what it believes are its interests. However, of course, China is not seeking military confrontation with other players in the region. What are the sources of tensions and where are these strategic divergences between Japan and China? Now, one aspect is fears of one another's potential military power. Japanese concerns are clearly focusing on China's military modernization, objectives of China's military modernization, China's advances in the Pacific. And as I mentioned earlier, a long-term concern in Japan by Tokyo decision makers is China seeking to dominate Asia in the mid to long term. And if you look from China's perspective, China narrative has been focused on Japan's remilitarization, very much linking the policies that were pursued, especially under Prime Minister Abe, reinterpretation of Article 9, focusing on expanding the role of the self-defense forces, linking that imperialism, as I will bring to your attention a little bit later in the presentation. And what in Chinese official discourse appears as the strategic squeezing by the US-Japan alliance, that the United States and Japan wants to cut China's entrance to the East China Sea and exit to the Western Pacific by essentially squeezing China's strategic space. From Chinese perspective, another concern is that Japan essentially does not want China and Taiwan to reunify because, according to Beijing, Japan that will fear that China will become a much more powerful competitor to Japan in Asia. So as you see, these are fears of one another's potential military power, how it will be used, what the objectives are, which are fueling and feeding mutual strategic distrust. And then an additional aspect are the shifting dynamics of economic inter or dependence. This is a very important change in the bilateral relations. Japan during the Cold War was the main provider of ODA, official development assistance to China. That was also a way for Japan to improve relations during the Cold War. China at the time was very pleased to have these mutual beneficial relations with Japan, exporting resources to Japan and being happy to be provided with ODA in order during the period of Deng Xiaoping to open up China and to focus on economic modernization. But now that has changed and Japan's relative economic importance to China has been diminishing, whereas China does remain, of course, the most important trade partner to Japan, which is fueling Japan's concerns of over dependence on China in the economic area, and stimulating Japanese leaders, Japanese decision makers to seek strategic diversification, especially in the economic area, away from China by expanding economic and trade agreements with countries beyond Northeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific, but also with the European Union. Where are Japanese concerns? Why is Japan worried? Why are countries in Asia worried? Why is the United States worried? And I'm sure you may have seen the way Chinese defense strategies define the priorities for them, the short to medium term, medium to long term, the first and second island chain. And of course, if we look at the first island chain, are essentially here in the red line. These are the key core interests for China, what China calls the lost territories, the disputed islands in the East China Sea from China's perspective, because from Japan's perspective, there is no dispute, the issue of Taiwan, and of course, the South China Sea, which Eva will discuss a little bit later. So this is now where China is focusing and preparing to defend its interests. The second island chain from Japan, Guam, and going south to Indonesia, this is more to mid to long-term perspective, which is a concern for Japan, for the United States, for countries in the region, that China may be seeking dominance over the Western Pacific in the long term. Shifting distribution of power, we clearly see in both cases China's military modernization, expanding its navy, the role of navy in national security, developing anti-access area denial capabilities, essentially capabilities to try to keep the United States and its allies, in particular the United States, from entering an operational area of conflict, in particular related to Taiwan. What recently has been known, China developing missiles, career killer missiles, which are actually designed to target US aircraft carriers, that are located far from Chinese continent, but also what is known as the Guam Express, essentially the new type of missile, which potentially may be able to hit Guam. A serious concern for Japan, as these, of course, capabilities, which initially China started building and are designed to deal with the Taiwan conflict, are very relevant to the East China Sea territorial dispute and very much concerning for Japan. Now, Japan's security activism, which we see gradually, actually starting also from during the period of the Koizumi administration in the early 2000s, and especially under the Abe administration, the second Abe administration, the change in the geographical and mission scope, the fact that self-defense forces now can operate beyond Japan, beyond Asia, they contribute to global security, to various international missions, they have a stronger role within the US-Japan alliance. And also Article 9 has been reinterpreted and was reinterpreted under Prime Minister Abe in 2014 to allow Japan to exercise its right to collective self-defense under specific conditions, which potentially, of course, includes also Japan defending the United States in case, of course, Japan's own security is under stake. Strategic shift in the case of Japan, the focus is on the East China Sea deterrence, so shift from what used to be Japan's priority during the Cold War, the conflict with the Soviet Union and Russia, and now focusing on southwestern islands and offshore islands in order to ensure that Japan's maritime space, where you have important synergies of communication, where maritime space remains open so that the United States is able to enter the East China Sea in case there's a conflict between the two. Now I move to the second point, shifting national identities. And here I would like to point out, firstly, Japanese national identity. Now, if we look at Japanese official discourse, since the end of the Second World War, there has been the narrative of pacifist identity, of course, very much rooted in Article 9, right, and the profound anti-militarism, which is still very much characteristic of Japanese society. But then from the 1980s, gradually a new conceptualization of Japanese identity emerged in line with what is known as an ordinary or normal state, later on also known as an international state identity. Very much the perception in Japan, especially in the later stages of the Cold War, when Japan, of course, became the second largest economy, and the growing understanding at the level of Japanese decision makers that Japan should be able to exercise and to engage in global political and security affairs commensurate with its economic power. And essentially, this normal power discourse have been widely discussed by academics, but also has become much more pronounced since the 2000s onwards, in the sense that Japan, while it does remain a peaceful state, it does not preclude Japan from being a normal state. In other words, a state is also able to participate in international security missions, a state that is expected by the international community to contribute to global security missions in line with what is understood as an international state identity. Now, if you look at Japanese nationalism, one aspect of Japanese nationalism has been certainly to promote popular pride. In other words, the understanding that Japanese young people should be proud of Japan, Japan being a model of a peace state since the Second World War, model democracy, a state that promotes liberal democratic values, and a state that also is contributing to global public goods. And so Japanese decision makers want the Japanese people, the younger generation, to, to be proud of this post-Second World War Japan, modern Japan, peaceful Japan, democratic Japan. There has been also generational change, which has been very much driving Japanese nationalism, in particular, the understanding that there should be this so-called post-war regime, in other words, that Japan should continuously apologize, that should end. The belief by some conservative politicians that Japan has apologized enough, which is also known as the apology fatigue in Japan. And even though Japan has apologized, by the way, more than 50 times to all its victims, and in particular also to China and Korea, from Japan's perspective, those apologies continuously not accepted in China and Korea. And they essentially continue to deny Japan's peaceful identity. In particular, China continues to be unwilling to recognize Japan's normal identity, which at the same time, Japan can be both peaceful and normal. So that has been very frustrating. And Japan as a normal state, very much in line with what became known as under Prime Minister Abe, proactive contribution to peace policies. In other words, that rather than being a one-state pacifist, that Japan will become now proactive contributor to providing global public goods. Now, Chinese national identity is very much rooted in the collective memory of the past. The victimization narrative is very powerful in Chinese national identity discourse. The century of humiliation, starting, of course, in the mid-19th century, and then ending with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the memories of how the Western imperialist powers, in particular Great Britain at the time, intervened in the Sino-centric regional order, cut China in pieces, took Chinese territory, so goes the Chinese discourse. So this victimization narrative has been a very strong aspect of this national identity discourse, which in recent years, not only under Xi Jinping, but already under Hu Jintao, the victimization narrative has been supplemented by the great power discourse. In other words, China rising again as a great power, China wanting to be respected as a great power, appreciated as a great power, and China that can also stand up to potential challenges and defend its interests in line with the quote that I showed a little bit earlier of one of the speeches of President Xi Jinping. The construction of Chinese national identity has been, of course, in line with this discourse. How that has been shifting this identity, if we look, for example, at Chinese history textbooks, there has been a clear shift in the construction of historical memory in history textbooks, where we see, for example, during the early Cold War years and until the 80s, the narrative very much focusing on the discourse on the civil war in China and the struggle between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang. But gradually from the 1980s, there was a clear shift in the focus of the history books towards emphasizing glorifying the role of the Chinese Communist Party in restoring the dignity and pride of China. And by glorifying the role of the Chinese Communist Party, the focus was then on the humiliation of China by Japan, which in turn led to, in the 1990s, also following with the patriotic education campaign by Jiang Zemin, to extremely negative perceptions of Japan in China. The US and Japan, there has been used clearly in China discourse of danger. They're perceived as containing China, that they don't want China to rise. There's also perception in China that they're continuously humiliating China, pointing the finger at China, or even intervening in China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So this China threat narrative has been also powerful aspect of Chinese discourse. If we look at Chinese nationalism, it has a lot to do with the changed Chinese Communist Party position. The fact that Chinese Communist Party really, since the end of the bipolar divide, the end of the communist-capitalist division, has been in need of new sources of legitimacy. And nationalism has been one important tool for Chinese Communist Party to provide legitimacy for the one-party state. Official patriotism has been Chinese official doctrine of state nationalism, essentially replacing the former, the declining appeal of communist ideology, but also the rising popular nationalism from below, bottom up. The fact that Chinese people are proud of Chinese achievements in military, economic, diplomatic areas. And there has been even certain pressure by Chinese people on the government to show to the world that, look, China can defend China's interests. China cannot be soft on Taiwan. China cannot be soft on Japan. And of course, Chinese leaders, since their legitimacy very much depends on these perceptions within China, the support of the population, of course, that in a way, this popular nationalism does tie the hands of Chinese leaders, even when they want to improve relations with Japan. One of the aspects of China's nationalist discourse has been the lost territories. The lost territories are referred to the territories lost during the century of humiliation, and which China, according to discourse, has the right to claim and return to reunify with the motherland, in particular Japan, in particular Taiwan, but also the East China Sea disputes and the South China Sea. And just a quote I find also quite important, illuminating from this perspective. We in China, as the five foreigners said, have endured the grievous lessons of having a weak national defense and suffering bullying by others. And that refers, of course, to the entrance of Great Britain in the Sino-centric regional order by Japan as well. The Chinese people have deep historical memories of this problem. And so we need solid national defense, giving essentially, explanation of why, the strengthening military power is so critical for China. So as this humiliation, past humiliation, will never again be repeated. If we look at Japan and China mutual perceptions, and opinion polls regularly show negative mutual perceptions, but instead of showing you specifically the percentage of people that see each other in China and Japan negatively, I thought that looking at the reasons for unfavorable impression would be more important in this case. If you look here in the case of Japan, so the upper part of the slide, so you have large majorities saying that continuing territorial issues over the Senkaku and Japanese airspace entry of, for example, Chinese aircraft in the waters, this is one of the important aspects. Then the second critical point why Japanese people have negative view of China is the actions that go against international rules. In other words, that's very much in line with Japan's support and maintenance of what Japan called the rules-based international order and maritime order, and perception that China operates against established rules and norms of behavior. And here also majority, less than 50%, 43 in recent opinion polls I have seen even in 48%, which are mentioning the different political systems with China. Now, if you look at Chinese public opinion, majorities here on the left side are concerned about what they call China's lack of a proper apology for its invasion of China. So that continues to be a strong perception that Japan has not apologized. So you see close 60% of Chinese people have pointed out here. Then you have Japan's nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, which happened some years ago. And then also a focus on Japan's attempt, what they call encircling China. In other words, that Japan is strengthening relations with countries around China. From China's perspective, this is a way to encircle and contain China. If you look at the historical issues that should be resolved, and you have a number essentially of answers that were given at the same time to the Chinese people and to the Japanese people, you see in the case of Japan, large majorities focus on China's anti-Japan education and textbooks. In other words, it does remain a particular concern in Japan that from Japan's perspective, Chinese Communist Party essentially reinforces and builds its legitimacy on promoting, on teaching and on promoting what China calls the correct view of history, which essentially, from Japan's perspective, is continuously demonizing and humiliating Japan. So for Japan, that does remain a very, very painful and concerning issue. If you look at Chinese public opinion, majorities pointed out Japanese perception of its invasion of China. In other words, for China, Japan still has not come to terms with its past, something that is absolutely unacceptable to the Japanese people, but for Chinese people, that's a main issue. Majorities have also mentioned Japan's perception of the Nanjing massacre and as issues related to the Japanese textbooks from Chinese perspective, that Japan does not teach the true history, and the issues related to Japan's lack of reparations for World War II, comfort women, and all these issues that are essentially wrapped up together and related to this different interpretation of historical memory as we see in China than in Japan. Now we have also these tensions, domestic politics and mutual perceptions in China, instrumentalization of history by the Chinese Communist Party in order to ensure and strengthen its legitimacy. And we see anti-Japan sentiments. These are essentially a product of both official patriotism, so top-down and bottom-up, the fact that Chinese Communist Party cannot be soft on Japan. This is something that popular Chinese people will not accept. In Japan, you have the ending of the post-war regime, the fact that believed by Japanese leaders that Japan has apologized enough, Japan has provided compensation to all its victims, and it's time now to move beyond that. And anti-China sentiments are very much growing in reaction, of course, to Chinese nationalism. So we see that conflict over historical memory reinforcing mutual strategic distrust rooted in the geopolitical competition, which I outlined earlier. And finally, the final section, very briefly, as I see that I'm doing good on time, but I understand that it's only a couple of minutes still remaining, manifestation of Sino-Japanese rivalry. One aspect I would like to point out is that we clearly see this emerging leadership competition in the Asia-Indo-Pacific. And I would like to show you that slide with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the overlap that clearly you see with the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, or vision as Japan calls it, in particular focusing on the, with a focus here on the maritime Silk Road and how it overlaps with various essentially initiatives and policies that Japan has been promoting within the framework of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, I would like to point out, because sometimes in comments or in analysis, I have heard remarks that Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision has been a pure response trying to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I would like to mention that I disagree with this vision, as Japan focuses on, for example, connectivity, infrastructure development, focusing on maritime security, capacity building initiatives that fall fall within the scope of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, these very much predate China's Belt and Road Initiative. So Japan, for a long time prior to the Belt and Road, had been engaged very much in engaging and cooperating with partners in Asia, in the Pacific region. But of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, which from Japan's perspective has also been a challenge to establish the rules and norms within the international community, has certainly been a driver for Japan to intensify interaction with many countries in this region. And then the second aspect I would like to mention is the East China Sea territorial dispute, a dispute essentially over 5 islands, the total being of 6 square kilometers, the territory of those islands, Senkaku in Japanese, Diaoyu or Tiaoyutai in Taiwan, the way they call them. A complicated dispute as well as also, as Eva will be discussing, this dispute in the South China Sea with a combination of different drivers, geostrategic drivers. Of course, we have the importance of the synergy of communication. You have, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Japan has to keep the East China Sea open, where you have, of course, Okinawa, the Senkaku Islands are located. This has to be open also when the United States, if and when there's a conflict with China, that the United States is able from Guam to approach and enter this operational theater. Whereas for China, from a geostrategic perspective, the United States and Japan have been squeezing China's space in the East China Sea, trying to cut off China's entrance to the Western Pacific. Economic significance, of course, the expectation of resources in the East China Sea, and the symbolic nature, in particular, the fact that this dispute has been linked to rising nationalist sentiments on both sides, in turn, which are very much linked to unresolved historical disputes between Japan and China, as I have pointed out earlier. Are the existing borders just or unjust? And I think that's very important to look at. From China's perspective, no. China says justice has not been done. And I just wanted to show you a quote, how China responded in 2012 when Japan nationalized 3 of the islands. China said that Japan legalized its stealing and occupation of Chinese territory and denied the post-World War II results. Indeed, a very, very strong statement. From China's perspective, these are territories that were stolen by Japan. These are territories that are essentially part of China, part of Taiwan. And since Taiwan belongs to China, they by definition also belong to China. And of course, following the end of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan got Taiwan, and China's argument that the island should have been returned later by Japan. Japan's view is exactly the opposite. The status quo borders are just, there's no territorial dispute. From Japan's perspective, Japan acquired the islands following a survey in 1895. So it has nothing to do with the Sino-Japanese War and the Shimonoseki Treaty in 1895, Japan says. Japan conducted a survey. The islands belong to no one, so terra nullius, and Japan incorporated them in Japan's territory. So from Japan's view, there's no territorial dispute. From the perspective of international law, Japan says these are Japanese territories, Japanese people have lived there, there have been economic activities, and Japan has administered those islands for decades. So you see, these are 2 completely opposite views on the perception of whether or not these borders are just and whether justice has been done. And finally, before concluding, Sino-Japanese relations, I called them in one of my publications, fragile stability. What we see since the 2000s, you have this periodic cooling off period. So you have tensions, then cooling off periods where we see, and we are now, since 2 years ago, we are in this phase of cooling off where we see improved diplomatic ties under Prime Minister Abe and President Xi Jinping, when Prime Minister Abe even suggested that, proposed that Japan may also participate in the Belt and Road Initiative on a case-by-case basis. And also Prime Minister Abe even said that Indo-Pacific strategy or vision does not exclude China. So this is a cooling off period where confidence building in the security area, diplomatic ties, there is improvement. But at the same time, you also have periods of serious tensions where the focus becomes very much on the competitive dynamics. But Sino-Japanese relations, even though I focused on the bilateral dimension this morning, they're not purely bilateral. And in fact, no relationship, I would even argue, in the Asia-Indo-Pacific is purely bilateral, because the United States is involved in most of these critical partnerships in relations in the region. So if you look at these relations from a perspective of a triangle, Japan, China, and the United States, both Japan and China, leaders in Beijing and Tokyo, they always, when they consider their mutual bilateral relations and devise strategies, they always with one eye focus at Washington. And what is quite interesting, based on my research, I have found that Japan and China each try to avoid a strategically disadvantaged position within this triangle. In other words, whenever China's relations with the United States deteriorate, China will be focusing on improving relations with Japan in order to avoid a simultaneous tense relations with Japan and the United States at the same time. And also that applies to the case of Japan, that when, for example, there are certain tensions with the United States or disagreements, Japan will also be looking at Sino-US relations. And if at the same time Sino-US relations, for example, are moving in the direction of cooperation, which was in the early years of the Obama administration, Japan will be careful to avoid simultaneously tensions within the alliance and escalation of tensions with China. Current drivers of rapprochement, clearly pragmatism, because focus on economics, on trade, some possible suggestion between the leaders for infrastructure development, but the roots of the tensions and of the rivalry of mistrust, they do remain. And moving towards the conclusion, I have on one side the combination and how these structural and identity shifts very much shape Sino-Japanese relations. In particular, historical narratives are very critical in this construction of Japanese and Chinese identities. They also feed mutual threat perceptions, which actually is also manifested in one aspect, is the mutual questioning of each other's moral authority that China continues to deny, for example, Japan's normal and peaceful identity, whereas for Japan, there's a continuous concern about China's great power identity and what does that mean for Japan in the region. In addition to that, of course, we have sources and drivers of geopolitical competition, the US factor. Shared interests, these exist between Japan and China, in particular in the area of non-traditional security issues, trade, economic cooperation, and strategic divergences are very much not only focused on the, as I discussed and mentioned, in the East China Sea, but broadly concerning the evolution of the regional order in the Asia-Indo-Pacific region. Okay, and I would like to thank very much the audience for your attention. I hope there were no internet interruptions and I could make my message clear to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Elena, for the fascinating journey into the complicated Sino-Japan relations. And our journey will take us a little bit further south with Eva right now. And just to say that we are already some questions, which is really, really excellent. And please do not hesitate to type more questions. We will extend, obviously, our session by 15 minutes because we started late. So until 1:45, we'll be able to discuss a little bit more. So please do not hesitate to raise other questions. And so with that, I will leave the floor to Eva.
Well, thank you very much, Céline, and many thanks to Elena for her fascinating presentation, lecture. It's always useful to be reminded of these deeply rooted points of tensions in the region, because it really gives us keys of lecture actually into some of the regional strategic dynamics and some of the conflicts that we see. Now, I wanted to discuss the South China Sea more closely and zoom south, as Céline said, and take it a little bit as an annex to this lecture, simply because, well, it is a key strategic interest for Japan. We already discussed that Japan is a maritime power. It is entirely dependent on free, open, and safe sea lines of communications. It is also because obviously the issue is related to China. It is mostly or mainly related to China, because it is a security hotspot that has been really stealing most of the attention. Nowadays, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it has really become the center stage of some of the regional security tensions. And finally, because it is an issue that is heavily internationalized, with implications for the international community and for European interests, as we will see. Sorry. Cut. So Elena already discussed the importance of territorial sovereignty and the lost territories for China. And just to give you an example, when we talk about the South China Sea in 2013, it has been declared by the Chinese officials as part of its core strategic interests, over which it has undisputable sovereignty, in the same way as over the territories of Tibet or Xinjiang, for instance. Elena discussed the East China Sea. We already discussed the East China Sea previously, but if you can see from the map, the East China Sea, as well as Taiwan and the entire South China Sea, are basically considered by Beijing as part of its integrated territory, something that is worth defending and over which it has a very uncompromising stance. Obviously, it is an essential part of the Chinese strategic space because it guarantees the access to the Western Indian Ocean. It is this first island chain that Elena alluded to, that is this core territory, that we find in the 2015 Chinese defense paper, and that has become roughly, let's say, since 2013, but mostly since 2015, a major theater of Chinese military or naval activity and a key focus of its naval buildup. Now, it wouldn't have been a problem if, of course, the South China Sea was contested space. It's not necessarily a Chinese part of Chinese semi-enclosed sea. It is in fact claimed by a number of other actors. Now, we always mention the infamous Chinese tongue-shaped 9-dash line that delimits almost 90% of the South China Sea. But it should be reminded that Vietnam also claims up to 70% of the South China Sea and the Philippines up to 30%. On this map, you see the shaded colors being the 200 nautical miles delimitations of exclusive economic zone as per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and those firm lines being the excessive claims, leading inevitably to overlaps and therefore disputes. We also have Brunei and Malaysia in the south, partly newly also Indonesia's claims over the Natuna Islands. So up to 5 or even 6 claimants if we do not count Taiwan. We're talking, in fact, about 150 island features. It's not even islands, it's rocks, it's low tide elevations that have been historically fishing grounds. As opposed to the East China Sea and the Senkaku-Diaoyu dispute, it needs to be mentioned that these islands have not been really islands, with very, very few exceptions, and have never been inhabited or source of any serious economic activities. The main 2 formations that we're talking about is the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, Paracel being disputed mainly just by China and Vietnam, and the Spratlys being really the accumulation of tensions over the last decade. Now, you can say that having overlapping territorial claims is not a problem per se. There are, in fact, many territorial disputes around the world that do not need to become a problem, as long as one or many of the parties decide to act on it. And this is where things just started to get sour. Since 2009, we have started gathering evidence of what we call island building, because as we saw, and I will show you some pictures after this, Most of the islands were not really islands, it's submerged features. So once you actually start building up those islands, they eventually can become islands and generate a safety zone or an economic activity or harbor life, and eventually generate legally perhaps a slightly different status, although that really hasn't been the case. The red triangles that you see a little bit all over are Vietnamese outposts, but let's not be fooled. These were mostly fishing, kind of sometimes, you know, wooden or very precarious fishing constructions, nothing too serious. The yellow ones are China's, Fiery Cross, Subi Cross, Johnson Reef. And of course, there are also some of the buildup of other claimant areas. But just to give you a little bit of a better idea of what we're talking about, this is before. This is a satellite image taken by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Needs to be given credit. If you are interested in island building, go and see them. This is an image, satellite imagery of Fiery Cross, Subi Reef, roughly around 2010, from 2010, 2013. And this is what it has become. These are images from 2016, with some of the not only, you know, acquired territories by dredging sand, but also some of the worrying features that analysts have been caring about, such as landing strips, radars, and facilities that are very much resembling to potentially harboring military capabilities. In fact, what we have been warning since 2015, 2016 has become reality. This is one of the latest imageries of the Fiery Cross Island, so one of the islands that you could see earlier, on which China announced the establishment of a search and rescue center and a research center just last year. So you can really see an evolution of you know, something that was basically looking as a tropical atoll to something that looks pretty much like a fully built island, potentially harboring military capabilities. The length of this landing strip is 3,000 meters, so capable of accommodating a strategic bomber. Now, why do we care? Well, we care, and Japan cares, because this is mostly about Japan's interests, because the South China Sea is located on some of the world's most important sea lines of communications. In fact, $5 trillion trade a year passes through those strategic waters. Of course, Japan, as an island nation, is not only dependent on this trade, but is also dependent on its oil and liquefied natural gas that is passing through these international waters. Japan, but also South Korea, let us remind that, is completely dependent on oil exports and imports up to 85% of its oil consumption from the Middle Eastern oil terminals. And let's not forget that it's also those vital bloodlines that connect Europeans with its economic powerhouses in China, in Northeast Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. The strategic importance infers from this economic importance, and we have talked extensively about the freedom of navigation, which is this basic principle guaranteeing international navies and seafarers access anywhere, anytime, at their peace. Of course, we are worried that with a number of those strategic outposts being built up by China, this free flow of international trade may eventually be hampered if things turn sour. There is also an important normative or principled importance of this conflict, because it clearly shows the disrespect in many ways of China and some of the claimants vis-a-vis international law. When I showed the picture, the map of the official exclusive economic zone and the excessive claims, clearly these are not in respect of international law. And we are facing a situation where might overweights law of what is right in these waters. We see an increasing pressure by China on all of the smaller claimant states. China, of course, prefers to deal with them bilaterally. This is some of the regular features that we see in China's diplomatic behavior all over, but it's been very much exemplified in the South China Sea. And overall, this conflict, the South China Sea, is always taken as a showcase of the way China understood and wants to act on its newly acquired maritime power and ambitions. So whatever happens in the South China Sea is very carefully watched by all the extra regional powers, thinking that this is something that may be reproduced elsewhere. Now, of course, since the last, let's say, 5 years, the situation has escalated or keeps escalating with the US deployment, regular deployment of the freedom of navigation operations. Since 2015, the US Navy regularly deploys to the region and, according to China, contributes to the exacerbation of the tensions. Now, we can argue, and I'm more than happy to get back to this in the Q&A session, how constructive it is. Nonetheless, it is a fact, and it is a fact that has been gravely accentuated in the context of the US-China rivalry. As I already mentioned, the conflict has become heavily internationalized because of its importance to all the major trading powers, or what we call extra-regional user states. Japan is one example for all the reasons that we mentioned and that Elena mentioned already. Unfortunately, the conflict already also has a very divisive and a negative impact on ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which some are direct party to the dispute, and some are not. Clearly, countries like Laos or Cambodia, which do not have any dispute with China, are not so eager to eventually join a common front with its neighbors and colleagues from ASEAN against China in this conflict, worried to jeopardize its own lucrative relationship with Beijing. What is not talked about enough is the heavy impact on marine natural environment. It is a disaster for fisheries. It is a disaster for the rich marine natural inhabitat of the South China Sea, which is full of beautiful corals, which have been, as you can imagine, quite damaged by the dredging, by the sand mining, and by this increased military activity in the region. Regularly, we witness violent clashes between fishermen. Regularly, you hear news from Vietnamese fishermen being exposed to some of the increasingly violent behavior of the Chinese fishing militias. And up to today, according to reports, we count up to several thousands of civilian casualties. So this goes beyond a purely military and symbolic and strategic importance. Now, of course, because we are in Europe, the European nations have been trying to take a stance. The French have been deploying routine exercises. They do not call it FONOPS, routine exercises to the South China Sea since 2016. The British have joined in 2018. Germany is considering sending its frigate. And of course, there are quite a few actually other ways that the European Union and Europeans themselves try to voice their concerns over this conflict. Now, what has been done so far? A lot, but never enough, or a lot to not much avail would be a quick answer. There's this ASEAN-China Code of Conduct negotiation process that has been going on for nearly 10 years. It did not manage to alter Chinese behavior so far. Nonetheless, it is an open channel of communication. We have had a ruling, which was a very important one between the Philippines and China, or a complaint that was deposited by the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2013. We had a ruling in 2016. Nonetheless, it has not been recognized by Beijing. The naval exercises, whether it's FONOPS or the European ones, have been mentioned. And again, is this a matter for debate? According to China and according to some of the coastal states, they do not necessarily contribute to easing tensions and may have an opposite effect. Nonetheless, they are of hugely important symbolic value because they do signal, they send an important message to China that this is absolutely unacceptable, because what it tries to do in its own historical waters are in fact international waters, and therefore unacceptable for the international community. There are quite a few things that Europeans have been trying to do, Japan has been trying to do, mostly trying to encourage the capacity and build the capacity of some of the third states, Vietnam, the Philippines, who have very little resources and capacities on their own to even enforce their law in their own borders. And there's a separate battle that takes place at the UN level with last year's developments of a series of depositions of notes verbales, including by European countries, signaling their support of the PCA ruling of 2016, and perhaps trying to push the legal frontiers of this battle at the UN level, which is, I believe, a rather promising development to be watched further. And I don't know, stop share. Okay, I'll stop here.
Yeah. Okay, I'm back. I wasn't very far. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Eva, for your excellent presentation with a wonderful illustration. And I think that we can say precisely in the case of South China Sea that one image speaks 1,000 words. So it was really illuminating to see that. So let's move now to the Q&A session. We have plenty of questions, so thanks a lot to the audience. It's going to make it really, really interesting. So for the sake of time, I will gather some of the questions together according to the theme and address it to Elena. And of course, Eva's expertise is not confined to the South China Sea. She's a great expert on Japan affairs too. So please, Eva, do not hesitate to step in for additional comment on this. So we've got a bunch of questions on the historical memory, identity, and how this is constraining Japan's foreign policy in the region. So especially one question on this, how, Elena, do you see the memories of the Japanese aggression pre-war in the region, constraining, limiting Japan's ability to build ties with its regional neighbors? And here in the question, we have a specific focus question mark on the Japan-ROK relations. I would like to add a question from my side regarding Japan-Taiwan also. Relations, you mentioned Taiwan sometime, but if you can elaborate a bit more on this, I would be much interested. And there is also this question of historical memory also, which is playing in a different ways than Beijing and Seoul in a relation with China, with Japan. Sorry. Of course, Japan's in the Southeast Asian countries. How this kind of memories is playing negative role or not anymore. It may be interesting to look at this. Another way to put it is that one question mentioned the fact that you insisted on the Japan's looking at multilateralism, strengthening multilateralism, and looking at multilateral solutions in the region, asking to asking if it was a sign of Japan's being maybe not so comfortable with unilateral moves in the region or with some of its neighbors. So that's also another way to put the question of historical memories. Another one is focusing on maybe domestic factors and asking how you can explain, if you can explain at all, the contradiction between what we see as many political, as you explained, many political apologies to China and South Korea regarding Japan's pre-war aggression, and sometimes the declaration or sometimes the political visits that we see to the Yasukuni Shrine, which is quite controversial. So how do you reconcile this in a way? So that's for the historical memory part. Other type of questions are focusing on Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific and the Japan's narrative, strategic communication attached to it. As you said, Japan's ODA, Japan's activities to fund infrastructure, quality infrastructure in the region is not new at all. It's not started, it did not start with the FOIP, but it seems that the Chinese narrative around the BRI is much stronger than Japan's. So is Japan's doing enough in terms of communication regarding FOIP? And before that, do you think that it's actually a kind of weak point in Japan's foreign policy, the strategic communication about what it's actually doing, because it's doing a lot, maybe not properly conveying it to the international communities? Maybe one last question for the first round for you. It's really a kind of a prospective question. It's asking you, what do you think will happen in the next 10 or 20 years between China and Japan? So that's not so easy, but you can lay out several scenarios if you're unsure of what's going to happen. So I guess we can start with this if you're okay.
Okay, absolutely. So many questions, and that's fantastic. That would have led to a fantastic debate if we were in a real-time seminar, right? But of course, this is still another opportunity. Concerning, let me see, because I work with two screens, and on my second screen I can see some of the questions. In particular, the first point about the relations and historical memories and in the region, Japan's relations, right? And with the focus on South Korea, that was one of the questions that you mentioned at the beginning. If you look at opinion polls, and I have been looking extensively at that and also showing to my students, and let's say you look at opinion polls in China, Korea, and then you take many Southeast Asian countries, you take India, you take even Europe, large majorities have a positive view of Japan, with the exception of public opinion in South Korea and China. And Japan has excellent, in my view, relations throughout the region with many, many countries. In fact, I have also, during my own research and interviews, I have asked specifically the question, is there any perception of Japan being a possible threat, Japan's return to militarism? And some people have laughed at me and they said, Japan returning to militarism? That's absolutely ridiculous. That was the answer that I was getting. Japan is seen as a very positive force in the region in many ways: economic, security, diplomatic force. Japan has extensive bilateral relations with most of the countries in recent years in the framework of these alignments that I have mentioned. Japan has expanded in the security area with countries around the South China Sea, but not only. Look at Japan's relations with Thailand as well, and other countries in the region. And in my view, it has a lot to do with the way history has been taught and interpreted in all these countries in the Asia Pacific. But why in China and Korea the issue continues to be. And there, I think, two aspects to it. One, and in particular with Korea. In Korea, I have looked at research which has found one very interesting pattern with Korean presidents, that almost all Korean presidents entering office start on a positive note with Japan. And almost all Korean presidents, when they pass the midterm of their presidency and go towards the second part, they focus on, you know, the history issues, on the comfort women, on the tensions in the Takeshima or Dokdo Islands, as they call them. And in many ways, this research actually uncovers this pattern that for Korean leaders, this domestic accountability is very critical to, for example, when they see negative opinion polls with regard to problems in domestic political economic performance, you have scandals, you have other issues. The way to sort of divert and distract the attention of public opinion is focusing on historical issues with Japan. In other words, this is diversification approach. You divert the public attention away towards external targets. And in a similar way, we can see in the case of China that for the Chinese Communist Party, legitimacy rooted in the fact that in the narrative that is the Chinese Communist Party that was the great savior of the Chinese nation. The great savior of what? Well, the great savior of China from the hands of, they call, of course, Japanese imperialists. So that is a very strong narrative. And Chinese public opinion, as I mentioned also during my presentation, they cannot allow leaders to be soft on Japan, even though there have been many cases when Chinese leaders have wanted to improve relations with Japan. Their hands, they have been tied by this public opinion that wants to see that on Japan, you cannot compromise. On Taiwan, you cannot compromise. They want to see their leaders defending what they see China's national interests. So the utility of history, instrumentalization of history, is seen in both China and Korea and serves domestic political purposes in both cases. And in particular in South Korea, as I mentioned, there is research that really finds that very interesting pattern of ups and downs. They enter office, they have a political positive discourse. With the exception of President Moon, when he entered office, he was already tough on Japan, on the comfort women and on the deal that Japan and Korea had. And towards the end of the term, even though they cannot be re-elected, there is a focus on historical issues. And in particular, this accountability, the role of public opinion, the role of civic groups, you know, the defendants, you have many groups, of course, in Korea defending the rights of the comfort women. Now, another issue was mentioned, and I find it a very right question indeed. How come Japan has apologized so many times, more than 50 times, and yet still this is not accepted? But again, the focus is on South Korea and China. I would not agree with the argument that Japanese apologies have not been accepted throughout the region, in Korea and China. And again, one part of the answer would be what I mentioned, the utility, right? The instrumentalization of history, the domestic political objectives that exist in these two countries. But there's also what, for example, in my personal interactions with Korean scholars, what they have been telling me is a concern in Korea, for example, about what they call the sincerity of Japanese apologies. They have told me that, for example, yes, there have been apologies, official apologies, and there was an improvement, for example, at the end of the 1990s between Japan and Korea relations when there was, again, an official apology. But what they have told me, the sincerity in the sense that, for example, there's an official apology, and then almost the same day, you have some members of the Japanese cabinet visiting the Yasukuni Shrine. And what these Korean scholars have told me that for us, this apology is nullified or negated because you issue an apology and the same day something happens which goes against that apology. And so we don't believe in the sincerity of that apology. Now, if we remember Prime Minister Koizumi, who visited the Yasukuni Shrine every single year when he was in office, right? And he also had an official apology to China, by the way, he issued as well. And he was saying, he got very, very angry at a certain point, and Prime Minister Koizumi said, Chinese leaders should not tell me where I may or may not visit in my own country. I go to Yasukuni and I pray for peace. And I pray that this horrible war, like, of course, the war that they went through in Asia, but also we went in Europe, that it will never again happen. In other words, from the perspective of Koizumi, was that he visits, he prays for peace, but he does not automatically deny Japan's aggression in the war. From his perspective, was also interference by China and Korea in what for Japan would be domestic affairs, right? So this would be my answer to this point that was mentioned by some members of the audience. Why is this, not accepted? Because you do have a contradiction between apology and then some behavior, which from Korean and Chinese perspective negates the sincerity, but also you have Japanese leaders having the interpretation what they're doing in their own country and visiting where they believe they may visit, praying for peace, which is absolutely unacceptable for China and Korea. They are denying Japan its peaceful identity, as I mentioned during the lecture. Let me see, the next question was about Taiwan. Yes, Céline, you mentioned, right? Taiwan, Japan's official policy is, of course, one China policy, right? That's Japan, similarly to the United States and other countries, the official policy is one China. Japan, I think, has been rather careful to maintain that policy and not to show some sort of support, for example, for Taiwan's independence or for the narrative in Taiwan under the current administration of Tsai Ing-wen. But of course, if you look from Japan's geopolitical, geostrategic perspective, there are concerns. And in my talks with the Japanese scholars, issues have emerged, such as if, let's say, indeed you have a reunified Taiwan and China, what would that mean from Japan's own geostrategic interest in the region? How would that affect Japan's interest? Would that have a negative impact? Is Japan fearing reunified China? I think Japan has been rather ambivalent on that issue. Japan officially has mentioned that, of course, it's very important to maintain peace in the Taiwan Strait and this peaceful resolution of the issues between Taiwan and China. But behind the scenes, of course, there's a debate concerning reunification, how reunification may happen. Will it be in a peaceful way? What would be the implications for the US-Japan alliance and these kind of issues? Concerning the historical issue, I have visited Taiwan several times. I have also had the opportunity to be the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs scholar for research at a certain time. And I have learned again that, or rather, during those visits, it was again reconfirmed to myself how important it is how you interpret and teach history. Because history is never objective, right? Whose history, right? My history, your history, their history. And as I have tried to illustrate with my presentation, historical memory, the way it's remembered, how it is remembered, what is remembered, what do the Japanese people remember, what they're taught at school, what the Chinese people, what the Korean people remember, really is very much different. And the context, domestic, external context is very important. And in Taiwan, actually, the narrative has been very, very different. Of course, Taiwan was a Japanese colony, right? Japan, it was a colony. We all know that. It's a historical fact. But the memories, if you look, of course, at the older generation in Taiwan, some of them, of course, still speak Japanese. But in the modern historical narrative, in the education, the promotion of Japan, Japanese manga, Japanese soft power culture, this is absolutely, Taiwanese people are fascinated. And I know from my Japanese friends, some of them have told me that they really love to visit Taiwan, that they feel so welcome there. And even I was amazed for the first time when I visited Taiwan, how you enter some of the shops and you see on the door written in Japanese, you have to press the button in order to enter, automatically the door opens. And they feel really welcome, because also the narrative in Taiwan has been very different because of Taiwan's own contest for legitimacy with China over the years since the Cold War until now. Education has been very different. Taiwanese people, of course, the main struggle has been with China, and the fact in recent years that President Xi Jinping has a very tough discourse on Taiwan, that the fact that military force is, of course, no longer excluded from a possible reunification. And so the discourse in Taiwan focused on that survival of Taiwan as a political entity rather than on the historical issues related to Japan's colonization, which no longer have that significance for leaders. In other words, again, the domestic politics, the utility, the use and abuse of historical narratives, I think we can see in all these countries and how it has changed and shifted over time. Finally, US-China relations in the next 10, 15 years, I generally do not like predictive or speculative answers to give. Because as we know, issues in contemporary politics, even though we can observe mid to long-term trends, we also know very well that sometimes things happen and that it really can shift in some areas of foreign policy behavior of countries. Like, for example, 9/11 is obviously one of the biggest examples in US foreign policy, when President Bush entered office and China was seen as a strategic competitor. And after 9/11, US foreign policy focused on the war on terror. China now was seen as a partner with whom you should work on the North Korean issue. Just one example. But looking at current trends, I think that the role of leadership in Japan and China has a critical role to play in the in the direction the way Japan and China will be evolving, whether or not they will be, so to speak, taking the same boat in that Asian region or separate boats, right? Whether they will be willing literally to cooperate, to work together, or to continue emphasizing competition. And so far, I have not seen that many kind of signals in either China or Japan of this, positive emphasis of the other, because as I try to illustrate with my presentation, the root of the Sino-Japanese competition, while we have the geopolitical dimension mostly pronounced and as a result of the shifting power balance in the region, in particular since the 2000s, US position in the region, Chinese position, Japan relative to China, the root of the issue is this mutual, inability and unwillingness to accept the positive other. In other words, very often the narrative in the two countries in constructing a positive self is by constructing a negative other, and that's your neighbor, right? And in my view, as long as you continue to see you're in a positive way by actually seeing your neighbor in a negative, or you gaining and they losing, the two countries will have difficulties, I think, moving in the direction, of really cooperative relationship. So that I do not think that issue, because it's a very deep issue, it's related to emotions, perceptions, history, suffering, of course, right? Wounds that have not healed. So 10, 15 years is, in my view, a rather short period of time for that deep wounds to heal. However, if that does not mean that Japan and China will not be cooperating. And I think here, if I bring the geopolitical or external dimension, depending on the shifts in the relative power distribution in the region and changes in the region, that may lead to cooperative relations in the framework of Belt and Road, free and open Indo-Pacific. We have seen under recent years under Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping that there is an improvement. But again, that's on the surface, because deep down, the unresolved identity issues do remain. And again, I think 10, 15 years is too short period of time for that to be resolved, but it doesn't exclude the healing to start during that period.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Elena. We have a few minutes left, but Eva, do you want to add something?
I would like to actually follow up on what Elena said and what has been raised in one of the questions on Japanese nationalism, if that's possible. because there's a direct correlation, and it's exactly what Elena said. The root of the problem is education. And we have, I mean, every country, of course, has its own way of interpreting history. Whose history matter? Elena said it all. But of course, Japan is not immune to the problem. The problem of historical amnesia has been voiced out in the context of Japan quite a bit. That doesn't mean that Japan does not teach history. It does not dwell extensively in the problem of Second World War. And perhaps not enough. That's a matter for debate. We are used in the European context on the German example, which frankly in the international spectrum is more an exception than the rule. It is true that there is a generational problem perhaps in Japan, with the new generation perhaps not being sufficiently aware or feeling guilty, if you want, for whatever has occurred during the Second World War, and perceives the attacks or those criticisms by China and Korea as ultimately very unfair, and does not understand where it comes from, because they have been educating with nothing has ever been really that wrong. So there is certainly this problem, but ultimately, should we worry about it? And that was one of the questions. Should we worry about Japanese nationalism? Well, have a look around. Every country is nationalistic, and there is a difference between a healthy nationalism and an unhealthy nationalism. And literally every country in this planet is concerned about this. Now, the problem where we are more perhaps concerned about the Chinese nationalism is related to the way the country behaves as an international player in general. What book do you play by? So would you rather, would you be more tempted to trust a partner that actually is fully kind of playing by the international norms and rules, or not? One of the questions actually has been related to Japan's promotions of multilateralism, capacity building, and of course the insistence on improving connectivity in the region that predates the Belt and Road Initiative. This is all part of a broader Japanese strategy to build a positive image. And frankly, there has been very little criticism, as far as I'm aware, over the past decades or even half a century of Japan's involvement in sustainable connectivity or capacity building over some sort of misdealings or unclear or shady dealings that unfortunately have revealed to be the case in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the question is not, we have to take this nationalism question as part of a broader foreign policy and security behavior of an actor, and that's where perhaps the concerns start. That's it.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Eva, for connecting the dots between the the leftover questions and add very important comment on this. So our time is up now. So I'd like to thank Elena for the amazing tour de force on this very complicated issue. It was very interesting, very fascinating, and very clear. So bravo. and thanks, Eva, for the comments and the focus on the South China Sea. So now I would like to end up with some self-promotion for the next activities of the Japan program. Yeah, so if you like this lecture, you should meet up again with us next week for a session on the Japan-US relations. Obviously, the other big key relations for Japan right now. And we will have a fourth session going on March 25th on Japan and India, which is also a very strategic partnership to the Indo-Pacific and to achieve this vision. But we are not confined to the lecture series. We have more to come as a public event and public webinar on March the 18th. You'll see that we will tackle the transatlantic relation and the Indo-Pacific implication for Japan and Korea. And we are holding a joint webinar with the US-based CSIS. So I really encourage everybody to connect and to follow this this conversation. On March 24th, we'll have another big event to introduce our Asia team at the VUB and the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, which look at moving beyond bipolarity, regional responses to the US-China competition in East Asia. So you can find all this information on this website. You can check the previous webinar lectures on our YouTube channel, and you can keep track with us and many activities on our Twitter account. So do not hesitate to follow us, and we are looking forward to seeing you again soon next week and in the other weeks for all the other events. So thanks a lot again, and apologies for the late beginning, but we hope that you all enjoy this great lectures. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.